Mark, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thanks, Wes. Ooh, what a treat to be here. This is my first time in Temple Emmanuel, certainly speaking here in the last 2+ years. And I will admit it is hard to speak about Israel after everything we've already heard and experienced this morning, the poignancy of Magash HaKesef and the music. And it is hard to follow that Bachor Habar Mitzvah, Aaron Mazal Tov. After hearing everything you're doing, including building that computer, I speak probably for many of us when I ask, I don't know what were we doing at our bar mitzvahs? We're not sure, but it sounds like you are on your way to an amazing journey. I was asked to speak this morning in a pretty simple way. Wes said, just come speak from the heart about what you love about Israel and about our community's historic and deep love of and relationship with Israel. And that is so simple, but so overwhelming because there's so much to say. So I thought I would just start by setting the context, because I think we're at a really powerful moment for our community, for the Jewish people, and the world. Let's start with the fact that we are, I believe, hopefully emerging from COVID. After a traumatic couple of years for this community and this world, we need to acknowledge, we are on the brink of a transition out of something that we have not even begun to heal from. So we're in a place of emergence, and yet I think we know we're emerging into a world where volatility and fragility and brokenness is the new norm. From anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, Colleyville just a few months ago, to obviously Ukraine, to the fragility of American democracy and its implications for everyone around the world. We're just in a fragile moment. I'll say it for Shira because she always teases me. We're in a liminal space globally. This kind of space in between of not knowing, and that can be a little scary. And since this is my first time back here, I want to pause, as I think we need to do as part of our COVID healing process, to say the way that the clergy and the leadership of this community and others around this greater Boston community held this community together and held people spiritually and emotionally really on your shoulders over these past 2 years is nothing less than heroic and extraordinary. The fact that I hear from so many people at Temple Emmanuel, we were socially isolated, and yet I feel more connected than ever to this community is because of your leadership and your sacred work. So thank you to all of you. And I think part of this moment calls on us to invest in reconnecting with one another. I think you can feel the desire to be together as a community, and it's a moment where we need to start looking forward with hope and reimagining our future together. So that's the moment. Now let's talk about the Jewish calendar for a second. Here we are in Sfirat HaOmer, the counting of the Omer. We are in the middle of Egypt and Sinai, on our way from freedom to responsibility, and that process doesn't happen overnight. That's a growing up and a maturation process, perfect for a bar mitzvah. You should see his eyes whenever I talk directly to him. But that's a process in between Egypt and Sinai, and then as we already heard today, we are in between last week's Yoms of Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut, and the next week or two where we're going to continue to have the opportunity to celebrate Israel. If you're interested, there's lots of opportunities around this community. You can probably find them on jewishboston.com. Monday night, I'm going to have the privilege of doing an event with Noah Tishby. Some of you may have heard of her, Israeli-American now actress and author of Israel, A Simple Guide to the Most Understood Country in the World. So I'll be in conversation with her Monday night. And since we've left Yom HaAtzmaut, we are now in the countdown to what I think is the miraculous fact that Israel is going to be 75 years old in less than a year. And next week, I'm super excited that we're also going to be announcing a new initiative that CJP is launching with partners from around this community that we're calling Spark, anchored by Israel's 75th Independence Day, but not exclusively about that. We're going to try to take at least 1,000 people from this community to Israel next year on a couple of very big experiences on Independence Day and then later in the year. People of every generation, families with young children, and we're not stopping there. We're going to create cohorts and community of learning and joy with any ways you're looking to find connection to Israel and to our community, whether that's arts and culture or politics or history. Any way in, we're going to create it. And the idea here is to not miss the moment for our community to say, we love Israel. We want to honor the miracle of 75 years. And Israel is going to ignite our collective effort to build and reimagine our future together. So be on the lookout for Spark. I hope many, many of you will come with us, whether that's with a cohort from Temple Emmanuel or in other ways. There'll be opportunities to sign up and connect. And I think it's going to really be an exciting launch of this next decade together and a powerful way to celebrate Israel's 75th. So we're in this space on the calendar. We're in this powerful moment as a community and a world. And then we get this Torah portion, which is basically smack in the middle of the entire Torah. So here we are, right in the middle, from the creation of the world to standing on the banks of the Jordan River about to enter the land of Israel, in this kind of powerful liminal space of journey and transition and unknown. And we get the mitzvah of Kiddushim to you. You shall be holy. I think it's a powerful message about what we're supposed to do when we're on that journey. Is to fulfill the mitzvah of being a holy people. And what I love about this mitzvah is that it's not about ritual alone, as we already heard. In this book, we move from the ritual and the ceremonial to the ethical in the interpersonal. Because what it means to be a holy people is to love your neighbor as yourself, and to pay your workers on time, and to not speak gossip about other people. It's in our day-to-day interactions. It's in the choices we make every day that we create a community worthy of the divine spirit. And I was reflecting on this idea of being holy, and I want to just share 3 dimensions of it that really speak to me and reflect what I love actually about Israel, because I think Israel has a lot to teach us about building a holy community. Number 1, you don't just be holy. Holiness is not a state of being. You pursue holiness. It's a journey, not a destination. And so we have to move beyond a binary of holy, not holy, to a process of elevating ourselves, of going just a little bit deeper through our actions, through our speech, through our intentions, one step at a time. It's a journey, not a destination. Number 2, Kiddushim Tiyu. That's in the plural, not the individual. It doesn't say go off on your own and meditate in the woods and pursue holiness. You create holiness as a community. We do it in relationship with one another. We do it through relationships with one another. That's what it means to be a covenantal people. And number 3, as we already talked about, you don't find holiness up there in the heavens. You create it right down here on earth through those day-to-day interactions, through the ways we treat one another, and by the way, through the messiness of living out what seem like very simple commandments. Love your neighbor as yourself is really easy until you don't like your neighbor. Then it gets messy. But that's where the work of holiness happens, right here on messy earth in the real world. And when I was thinking about what I love about Israel and the moments that stick with me, that really capture for me what Israel is all about, they actually align with those 3 elements of holiness. So here we go. Number 1, Israel is a land and a country that is very much in process. You know, the fact that we even have a state, the fact that we rebuilt a country literally out of the ashes, the fact that we're no longer just wandering the world passively in history, but we now have agency. We have a government, we have an army, we have an economy for which we're responsible. Like, that is kind of dayenu. It is miraculous in and of itself, but it's only the beginning of the story. Because Israel's just getting started. It's not like we got our state, arrived, and we're done. But I think even the most fervent religious people who think of Israel in messianic redemptive terms don't say the redemption's over. They say itchalta de geula, the beginning of the redemption. Everyone knows the process is just starting. So Israel is a land that is in process. This last trip, I was with my family, and I had one of these poignant personal moments that captured this so beautifully. My wife and I took my kids to visit a place in Tzfat called Livnot Ulehi Banot, which is a place where she was really formed in terms of her Jewish journey. And we introduced our kids for the first time to one of her teachers, who's a tour guide, and he invited us to go on a hike in the Galil to a place called Tel Yodfat. And we're walking around this beautiful land, which of course is also part of my love of Israel. And he pauses and he shows us the Tel. By the way, if you've been to a Tel in Israel, you know a Tel is like a mound. But it's a mound that is so rich with history because in every era, something has happened there, and then usually it's been destroyed, and then more is built on it, and then it's destroyed, and then more is built on it. And here are my kids listening to my wife's teacher in this incredible intergenerational moment where I'm like, God, our family is in process of figuring out how we create Jewish identity and connection to Israel for our own children. And then they're looking at a Tel, which represents the process of building one generation after another, and the notion that we're just getting started of figuring out how to build on the foundations of our past and create our future. And it also represents the power of digging, because anywhere you dig in Israel, you find history and you find meaning. And to me, that is such a powerful metaphor for a country and a land that is about process. And that's true for the modern state as well. Think of the words chalutzim, bonim, pioneers, builders. These are the people that created and continue to create the state. Even hatikva, hope. The national anthem is not called the arrival. It's called the hope. And even 75 years after we have our own country, we have a national anthem that's about longing. Eyes toward Zion, even when you're in Israel yourself. And then I think about this recent trip when I sat with my son, who's there on a program with Americans and Israeli kids who are wrestling with Jewish peoplehood and Israel and North American Judaism. And his Israeli friend said to me, what if we don't want to live in Israel? Like, what does that mean for our Zionism? And I think about the Israeli leaders and the Wexner program or the Ma'oz program who come here to Boston and meet with me and are pushing me so hard. We have a state now. Why are you still in Boston? And what do we mean to you? How do we do this thing called building the Jewish people together? And you think of the IAC, not your IAC, the Israeli American Council, that is building community and identity for hundreds of thousands of Israelis in this country, 30,000 here in Boston, who aren't going anywhere. But they're recreating their own Jewish identities through their connection to Israel and their lives in America. These are things that I don't think the pioneers thought of. The questions about Zionism and Jewish peoplehood in the 21st century are messy. And the fact that we even get to ask them is miraculous. And I'll just say we're only at the beginning of the journey. And it's going to be hard because they're questions without easy answers, but I love the fact that we're in this process of wrestling together. I want to move from journey to people because for me, every time I go to Israel, I always have a moment where I remember that what I love about this place is not the place, it's my interactions with like regular Israelis. Usually it's like someone selling fruit in the shuk, in the market, or often, almost always, it's a taxi driver. But we know that Israel is not just a place, it's not just an idea. It's a living, breathing country of millions and millions of people. And what we know about the people in Israel is, number one, they're extraordinarily diverse. I remember the first time I went to Israel, I had been in these universities that celebrated multiculturalism, and I went to Israel thinking, it's going to be so homogeneous, like all Jews. Little did I realize, I knew nothing about what Jewish diversity looks like until I went to Israel and saw kibbutz galuyot, what an ingathering of the exiles looked like. Israel can teach us a thing or two about diversity and inclusion. And of course, the people there are like family. An Israeli just said at a Yom HaZikaron program, she said, people sometimes say we're rude and direct. No offense to any Israelis. But the truth is we just feel like family, and we talk to each other like we're family. You know, right? Who hasn't had the situation where you stop a taxi and they say, like, where are you going? I'm like, I'm going to Merkaz Ha'ir, the center of the city. No. No, I don't feel like it. You know, that's Israel, but that's family. And of course, family, it's such a small country, everyone has been touched by the loss Wes just talked about. There's a sense of arevut, of interconnectedness, that we have something powerful to learn from. For me, this last trip, my moment happened in a taxi. I was talking to my taxi driver, who was clearly a Jew, an Israeli Jew from the former Soviet Union, and it was a tense time these last few weeks, as you know, and I said, like, what's the matzav? How are you feeling about the situation? And he said, I'm not feeling that good about the Israeli, this was in Hebrew, I'm not feeling that good about our government. And I said, do you miss Bibi? Knowing, by the way, that lots of Israelis do. And he said, Tireh, look, Bibi did really, really bad things to our democracy. I'm quoting the taxi driver right now. I'm not making a political statement. He said, Bibi did really bad things to our democracy, but I feel less safe now that he's not in office. How's that for messy and complicated? And that's the commentary of the taxi driver. And then my mind is exploding. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this is exactly the way that American, especially liberal American Jews, do not understand the Israelis that loved Bibi. And then I start thinking about the fact that Israelis, who many of whom love Trump, don't understand why especially liberal American Jews don't love Trump. And then I started thinking about Danny Gordis's last book, Divided We Stand. And I'm sitting there, this is 2 minutes in the taxi, thinking we're growing apart. This is exactly the problem. And then I actually stopped and realized this is a Jewish taxi driver in a Jewish state from the former Soviet Union, where he might not even have known he was Jewish. By the way, maybe with a PhD in math also. Who's talking to an American in Hebrew about our government. That's a miracle. That's Herzl's vision come true. And the fact that we can even have that conversation, as much as we struggle to understand one another, is what it means to stay in deep relationship with each other. And to me, that's exactly what the state of Israel is all about. By the way, I think this is what Yehuda Amichai meant when he wrote his poignant poem in 1980 called Tourists. Tayarim, I can't read you the whole thing because A, it's too long, and B, the first half is too hard, honestly, to read. It's too harsh. But I'm just going to read you this little piece because I think it's what people and relationships are all about. He says, once I sat on the steps by the gate at David's tower, having laid 2 heavy baskets by my side. A group of tourists stood there surrounding the guide, and I served as their reference point. You see that guy over there with the baskets? A little to the right above his head is a Roman arch. Now, a little to the right of his head. But he moved. I said to myself, redemption will come only when he says to them, you see that Roman arch over there? Insignificant. But next to it, a little to the left and below, sits a man who just bought fruit and vegetables for his family. That's powerful. By the way, I think our community and our Boston-Haifa connection got this a long time ago. Israel isn't just a place that we send money to. Israel is our family. And if we want to invest in the future of Israel and the Jewish people, we do it in deep, authentic relationships with one another, 1 day at a time, 1 year at a time, 1 decade at a time. That guy sitting next to that arch is our extended family. That's, by the way, what Kiddushim to you means. We do it in relationship and through relationship, and that's what Israel is all about. Okay, the last piece. In recent years, I have to say my Israel trips with leaders from this community have changed a little bit. And they've shifted from what I think Wes might have called Disneyland Israel showing people the good, showing people only the miracle that feels like this country is perfect and we just have to protect it, to meeting with leaders and grassroots activists, honestly, from across the political spectrum, who start by saying, we got problems. This country is not perfect. This is a real world place. But here's what I'm doing to make it better. And the people who are working in so many ways to pursue a better, more righteous, more compassionate, more just Jewish state where all of its inhabitants can thrive, not in spite of its problems, but because of them. The people who love Israel, not in spite of its earthliness, but precisely because they know that earthliness and that messiness is the miracle of Israel, those people are our partners, and they are our inspiration. Twice in the last 2 trips I went, with some of you out here, we visited a place in Haifa that we helped to co-create called Horim B'Merkaz, Parents at the Center. Most people don't ever visit this place. They don't even know it exists. It's a center for new mothers and their children because especially for Israelis and Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis and people from every background who don't have access to resources or family, it's like really hard those first few years of raising children. And we built a center together with our Israeli partners. And when they started to build this center, Israeli Jews, Israeli Arabs, Russian-speaking Jews, Ethiopians, they told us it almost couldn't work. They almost couldn't figure out how to create community together. And now you meet with these young mothers, and they tell you it saves their lives. And we met with them this past summer, right after last May, which you may remember was disastrous, especially for the Arab-Israeli and Jewish-Israeli relationships. And they said to us, we maybe have never been through a harder time. We weren't even sure people would even come. And one by one, these mothers came. Jewish mothers, Arab mothers. And they said, we are not going to let extremists destroy our country because times are hard, but this is precisely when we need to keep coming back and keep building. What choice do we have? It's our future. These are the people who you most of the time don't visit on these trips, but they are the heroes, the pioneers, the builders of the future of Israel. They're the people that remind us that Kiddushim to you doesn't happen just in Yerushalayim Shel Mala, in the Jerusalem of the heavens. It happens in Haifa Shel Mata, real world Haifa, and that is what I love about Israel. I want to end with something that's a little heavy and intense, but I feel like it's okay, because it's also poignant and inspiring. And it captures for me what the miracle and the messiness really are all about. I also feel compelled and a little emotional to pay tribute to my friend Marla Bennett, who is one of 2 Pardes students who were killed in the Hebrew University bombing 20 years ago this year. It's a 20-year yahrzeit. And she wrote this was a young woman who was studying at the Pardes Institute of Jewish Studies, who was on a journey, who was living out these aspects of Kiddushim to you and of Israel. And it was a very hard time in Israel, if you remember. It was the Second Intifada. And she wrote this article for her local town newspaper in California. And I just think her words say it so beautifully and powerfully. She says, I've been living in Israel for over 1.5 years now, and my favorite thing to do is go to the grocery store. I know, not the most exciting response from someone living in Jerusalem, but going grocery shopping here means that I live here. I am not a tourist. I deal with Israel in all its complexities, confusion, joy, and pain every single day, and I love it. In September 2000, I began studying at the Pardes Institute of Jewish Studies. I've learned more in my first 1.5 years than I learned in my entire undergraduate career. But my learning is not a result only of the hours I spend in the Beit Midrash, in the study hall. It's because of life in Jerusalem. Here I have found a community of seekers, People like me who want to try living in another country, who want to know more about Judaism, who are trying to figure out what they want their lives to look like. The air is charged with our debates and discussions as we try to integrate everything we're learning into our lives. Life here is magical. It's also been difficult. My time has been dramatically affected by the security situation and events happening around me. This is undoubtedly a historic moment for Israel and the Jewish people. It is difficult and unpredictable. There is no place in the world where I would rather be right now. She wrote that months before her life was tragically cut short. But I think her words, for me, are such a poignant reflection, and her life, of the miracle that is the messiness of Israel. And I'll just say that as I think about the fact that we as a community are living through an undoubtedly historic moment for Israel, the Jewish people, and the world, as we look toward Israel's 75th, there is no place else I would rather be than there and with all of you. There is no other time in history I would rather be living than right now, and there is no other community in which I would rather be creating our shared Jewish future, deeply invested in Israel and the Jewish people, and deeply committed to fulfilling the mitzvah of Kiddushim to you, of building a holy community and a better world. There is no other community with whom I'd rather be doing that than you and this incredible Boston Jewish community. Thank you for being on this journey with me. Shabbat Shalom.